Ever notice how every generation gets a main character era except Gen X? Boomers get analyzed like a historical documentary. Millennials get dissected like a sociology thesis. Gen Z gets studied like a brand new software update. And Gen X is like the person holding the ladder while everyone else argues about whose turn it is to climb. They're the middle child generation, the bridge, the ones who quietly keep things running, then get absolutely zero credit for it. So today, we're giving Gen X their spotlight, not to stereotype, not to start a comment war, but to explain something a lot of people feel in their bones. Gen X didn't become independent and sarcastic by accident. Their psychology makes perfect sense when you look at what they grew up with. And if you're Gen X watching this, there's a strong chance you're about to say out loud, wait, that's literally me. All right, let's do it. First, who is Gen X? Most researchers place Gen X as people born roughly between 1965 and 1980, which means Gen X grew up in a rare in-between world. They remember life before the internet, but they also helped build the internet. They learned on cassette tapes, but adapted to streaming. They wrote in cursive. And now they reset your Wi-Fi. Gen X is basically the generation that can both fix your printer and make fun of you for owning a printer. That mix, competence plus irony, didn't come from nowhere. It came from the emotional weather of their childhood. Let's paint a scene. You're a kid, school ends, and you go home, and the house is empty. No texts, no location sharing, no I'm watching you through the doorbell camera, just you. A key, a microwave that might explode, and a strong sense that you should not die before your parents get back. That's not exaggeration. This was a real cultural pattern. A lot of Gen X grew up as what people called latchkey kids. And psychologically, latchkey childhood creates a specific kind of wiring. Self-reliance becomes your safety system. Because if you learn early that no one is coming to rescue you from boredom, mistakes, or awkwardness, you stop expecting rescue. You become the person who reads the instructions, checks the map, packs an extra charger, and quietly assumes something will go wrong. So you'll need a backup plan. Not because you're negative, because your brain learned preparation equals peace. And this is the first big Gen X psychological trait. Gen X has a strong internal survival mindset. They don't always call it anxiety. They call it being realistic. Why Gen X often feels emotionally controlled. Here's a weird Gen X experience. They care deeply, but they don't always show it. They'll help you move apartments without complaining. But if you ask them how they're doing emotionally, they suddenly become a brick wall with legs. Why? Because many Gen Xers learned early that emotions weren't something you processed. Emotions were something you handled. You didn't talk it out. You got over it. You didn't share your feelings. You did your homework. Gen X grew up with a lot of cultural messages like, stop crying, don't be dramatic, life's not fair, rub some dirt on it. So instead of learning emotional expression as a normal skill, they mastered emotional management. That's why Gen X is often calm in a crisis. They can handle chaos like it's a Tuesday. But the trade-off is some Gen Xers struggle to ask for support before they're already at their limit. So they become the person who says, I'm fine, while actively disintegrating inside. Now let's talk about trust. Gen X grew up in an era where a lot of authority structures looked shaky. Not just politics, family and work too. Many Gen Xers watch adults preach stability, while divorce became extremely common. They watch people work hard for a company, then get laid off like it was nothing. So their brain filed away an important lesson. Loyalty isn't always rewarded. That's why Gen X has a reputation for skepticism. But it's not cynicism for fun. It's a protective adaptation. If you watch the plan collapse more than once, you stop building your identity around the plan. You start building it around your skills. Gen X doesn't always trust systems. They trust competence, which is why so many Gen Xers are obsessed with being useful. Not flashy, useful. They want to be the person who can fix the problem, solve the crisis, keep the lights on, and then quietly disappear back into the background. Gen X is allergic to performative anything. They don't want applause. They want results. If you've ever met a Gen Xer who responds to emotional intensity with a joke, yes, that's a thing. Gen X humor is legendary. Dry, sharp, slightly unhinged. The vibe is often, I am in pain, but let's make it funny before it makes me cry. This is a real coping style. Psychologically, humor can act like a pressure valve. It gives your nervous system relief without forcing vulnerability. And Gen X got really good at it. They learned how to keep things light, how to downplay discomfort, how to pretend something doesn't bother them, even when it absolutely does. So, if you're Gen X and you've ever thought, why am I like this? Sometimes the answer is because sarcasm was the safest form of emotional expression you were allowed to have. The Gen X relationship with authority, don't tell me, show me. This one is huge. Gen X often doesn't automatically respect titles. They respect competence. If you're skilled, consistent, and fair, Gen X will ride with you. If you're incompetent but confident, Gen X will smile politely and roast you internally for the next 12 years. They're not rebellious just to be edgy. They just grew up watching enough adults get things wrong that they became very sensitive to fake leadership. So Gen X has this mindset. Explain it clearly, prove it works, then I'm in. And in the workplace, that can make them great problem solvers, low drama collaborators, and completely intolerant of pointless meetings. Gen X doesn't want a motivational speech. They want the plan and maybe coffee. Gen X and privacy? Why are you posting that? Let's talk about the internet. Gen X is actually incredibly tech capable, but they're also more likely to feel weird about oversharing because they grew up in a world where your embarrassing moment stayed local, your mistakes didn't go viral, and privacy was normal, not suspicious. So to Gen X, putting your entire life online can feel less like self-expression and more like volunteering for consequences. That's why many Gen Xers prefer small circles, private jokes, low visibility, and control over who knows what. Not because they're boring, because their brain equates visibility with vulnerability. Gen X strengths, the quiet superpowers. Let's give credit where it's due. Gen X has some psychological superpowers that don't get hyped enough. 1, high adaptability. They've lived through massive cultural change and kept moving. 2, crisis competence. When things go wrong, they become weirdly calm. Like, okay, here's what we do. 3, independent thinking. They don't just follow trends. They evaluate. 4, loyalty to people, not institutions. They may distrust systems, but if you're their person, they show up, often quietly, often without posting about it. Gen X love language is not always words. Sometimes it's, I fixed it. Gen X struggles, the hidden cost of I've got it. Now the part that feels a little too real. Gen X's independence is powerful, but it can also become a trap. Because if you learn early that needing help is unsafe, you can carry that belief into adulthood. And then you become the person who handles everything, supports everyone, stays strong, stays useful, stays fine. You burn out. And the scariest part, you might not notice you're burning out because you're so good at functioning while tired. So if you're Gen X watching this, here's a gentle reminder. You don't have to earn rest by collapsing. You don't have to prove strength by suffering silently. You can be capable and supported. Signs you might be Gen X. Quick hits. All right, quick speed round. If you're Gen X, you might relate to things like you can entertain yourself for hours and don't understand being bored as a crisis. You hate being filmed unexpectedly. You prefer direct communication over vibes. You don't trust overly enthusiastic promises. You learn to troubleshoot by clicking random buttons until it works. You don't need constant praise, but you do want basic respect. You have a deeply complicated relationship with the phrase team building activity. You're simultaneously tough and secretly soft. You'll help people, but you don't want to parade about it. If you nodded at any of those, yeah, welcome home. If you're not Gen X, how to understand them better if you're younger and you're trying to connect with a Gen Xer, here's what helps. Be real. Don't oversell. Be competent, or at least be honest when you're learning. Respect privacy. Don't force emotional exposure. Don't mistake calm for not caring. Gen X may feel deeply, they just express it differently. And if you're older and you're trying to connect with Gen X, recognize their quiet efforts, notice what they carry, and remind them it's okay to receive help too. Gen X is the generation that learned to survive quietly. They were raised on independence, adapted through chaos, and still somehow became the ones holding everything together. They're not invisible because they have nothing to offer. They're invisible because they never needed attention to function. But honestly, they deserved more recognition than they got. So if this video made you feel seen, tell me in the comments, what's the most Gen X thing about you? And if you're not Gen X, tell me this. What's one Gen X trait you admire or don't understand at all? Hit subscribe if you want more psychology that feels like someone just read your diary, respectfully, from a safe distance, with a joke at the end. See you in the next one.